The sun was setting behind the shimmering horizon, casting an orange glow across the private terminal of the airport. The usual hum of private jets filling the sky had settled into a calm hush, but the air was thick with anticipation. A luxury jet, sleek and polished, stood waiting for its passengers, engines quietly idling. Among the crowd of travelers, one woman stood out, not only for her impeccable style but also for the serene confidence with which she moved. She wore a tailored black dress, her hair pulled back into a neat, elegant bun. A large, structured handbag rested on her arm, and her heels clicked sharply against the polished floor as she approached the security checkpoint. Her name was Olivia Matthews, a name that carried weight in both the world of finance and aviation. Despite her presence, she walked through the terminal with the quiet grace of someone accustomed to the privilege she had earned through years of hard work and perseverance. As she neared the entrance to the private jet, she was met by a security guard who stood with an expression that immediately struck her as hostile. A man in his mid-40s, with a thick build and a pair of dark sunglasses that shielded his eyes from the light. The guard took a step forward as Olivia came closer. "Excuse me," he said in a tone that felt both condescending and dismissive. "Can I see your boarding pass?" Olivia paused, slightly surprised. She had expected routine checks, but something about the man's demeanor unsettled her. Reaching into her bag, she handed over her documents with practiced ease, giving him a polite but pointed smile. "This is a private flight. I'm sure it's just a formality," she replied smoothly, her voice calm. The guard took the boarding pass from her and looked it over slowly, then glanced up at her, eyes narrowing. "This flight is for a select group of passengers. You sure you're in the right place?" Olivia's expression didn't change. She was used to encountering people who questioned her presence in spaces they thought she didn't belong, but there was something different in the guard's eyes, a suspicion that didn't seem to fit the situation. "I'm certain," Olivia replied, standing tall. "I've been traveling on this flight plan for years. I'm sure my name is on the list." The guard hesitated, his eyes scanning her once more as if he were trying to place her in a category. He looked at her sharply, clearly trying to assess her worthiness. He muttered, then handed back her boarding pass. "You don't look like the kind of person who flies private jets. I need you to step aside for a moment." The word stung more than she cared to admit, but Olivia kept her composure. She took a deep breath, noticing that a small crowd had begun to form behind her, most of them silent but watching with curiosity. "What do you mean by that?" Olivia asked, her voice measured but cold. The guard didn't respond right away. He simply gestured toward a small, sterile bench near the terminal wall. "Please wait here." Olivia glanced around at the growing number of onlookers. Her intuition told her this wasn't just a routine check. There was something more at play, something she had encountered before. It was the look in his eyes, the subtle dismissal that implied she didn't belong. As she sat down on the bench, she caught the eyes of a few other passengers who were eyeing her with a mixture of curiosity and confusion. None of them stepped forward to speak up, though. They were simply watching the scene unfold as if it were a spectacle. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as the guard spoke to his colleagues, clearly trying to confirm something. But Olivia knew one thing for certain: this wasn't about paperwork. It wasn't about her boarding pass or any flight list. It was about him deciding who belonged in this space and who didn't. And she wasn't going to let him make that call for her. The minutes dragged on, each tick of the clock amplifying the growing tension in the air. Olivia sat patiently, her hands clasped together in her lap, but inside, her mind was racing. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, their silence making the moment even more unbearable. It wasn't just about getting on a private jet anymore. It was about the kind of judgment she had been enduring her whole life, an insidious kind of bias that no one ever spoke about, but everyone could sense. The guard came back after what seemed like an eternity, still holding her boarding pass, now crumpled slightly at the edges. He was flanked by two other security personnel, both of whom were giving her a quick, dismissive glance before turning their attention elsewhere. They clearly weren't concerned about her. She was just another inconvenience in their eyes. "You can't go on the plane," the guard finally said, his tone final, almost rehearsed. He crossed his arms, eyes still scanning her as though trying to uncover something about her that didn't fit. Olivia's stomach tightened, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I don't understand. Why am I being denied boarding?" She tried to keep her voice steady, but it quivered slightly, betraying the rising frustration inside her. "You don't look like you belong here," he repeated, his eyes briefly scanning the terminal as if to emphasize his point. Olivia took a deep breath, her mind racing for a response that would dismantle his prejudices, but she realized with growing clarity, that this wasn't about the way she looked or even the boarding pass she had handed him. This was personal. He had already made up his mind about her based on her skin, her demeanor, the very fact that she was a black woman standing in a place that, in his eyes, wasn't meant for her. "How about you check again?" Olivia's voice was calm, but beneath the surface, there was a deep, simmering rage. "I'm here for the same reason everyone else is, because I've earned my seat." The guard scoffed, rolling his eyes as though she were simply a nuisance. He didn't bother looking at her documents again. He didn't need to. He had made his judgment. "I've already told you," he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "You don't belong here. I suggest you leave before things get any worse." Olivia stood up, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. "You have no right to treat me this way," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I've got the papers to prove who I am, and I'll be boarding that plane." But the security guard remained unmoved. He looked down at her, sizing her up like she was nothing more than an obstacle to his routine. The other passengers had started to murmur quietly among themselves, but no one stepped forward to intervene. They were all too afraid of causing trouble or drawing attention to themselves. A cold, heavy silence enveloped the space as Olivia held her ground. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, but there was no turning back now. She had come this far, and she wouldn't let some small-minded guard dictate her fate. "Is this how you treat all your passengers?" she asked, her tone sharp. "Or is it just people who look like me?" Her words hung in the air, cutting through the tension that had built up. The guard's face flushed with anger, but instead of responding, he simply motioned for one of his colleagues to call the airport manager. Olivia knew the situation was escalating, but she wasn't backing down. Minutes later, a man in a dark suit appeared, walking briskly toward the group. He was the airport manager, his stern expression indicating that he was used to handling problems like this. He extended his hand toward Olivia, but she didn't take it. Her gaze was fixed on the guard, who was standing off to the side, glaring at her as though she were the one who had caused this trouble. "I understand there's been some confusion," the manager began, speaking to Olivia in a more conciliatory tone, "but our security team needs to ensure that everyone aboard these private jets has the proper clearance." "I've already shown him my boarding pass," Olivia replied, her voice tight with controlled anger. "And yet, he insists I don't belong here because of the way I look." The manager's eyes flickered briefly to the guard, then back to Olivia. He hesitated, clearly unsure how to respond, but before he could say anything, the guard spoke up. "She's not on the list. She's lying about who she is." Olivia's jaw clenched. The lie was so blatant, so ridiculous, that it was almost laughable. This wasn't about the list. It was about him feeling superior, about him thinking he could control who had the right to be in this space. "That's a lie," Olivia said firmly. "I'm the owner of the company that owns this jet, and I'll be boarding it now." The manager looked taken aback. He glanced between the guard and Olivia, clearly uncertain of how to handle the situation. It was obvious to him that there was more to this than just a simple case of mistaken identity. "Just a moment," he said, raising a hand to stall Olivia's next move. He stepped aside to make a call. Olivia stood there, holding her ground. While the tension in the terminal thickened, she could hear whispers among the other passengers, some of them now realizing the situation for what it was, but no one spoke out. No one wanted to risk being involved. She was on her own. The minutes seemed to stretch into infinity as the manager stood off to the side, making his call. Olivia's patience was wearing thin, but she remained composed, keeping her eyes firmly on the guard who had started all of this. He avoided her gaze, looking instead at his colleagues, clearly hoping that the situation would just disappear. As the minutes ticked by, Olivia felt her resolve hardening. She could feel the weight of the eyes on her, the other passengers, the staff, but there was one thought that kept her grounded. She would not allow herself to be pushed out of this space. Not today, not by anyone. The manager finally returned, his face slightly paler than before. He walked toward Olivia, his eyes flickering uneasily to the security guard, who was still standing a few paces away. "I'm terribly sorry for the inconvenience," the manager began, his voice now noticeably less confident. "It seems we've had a misunderstanding. We've checked the records, and you're absolutely correct. You're listed as the passenger for this flight. Will make sure that this doesn't happen again." Olivia's heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her face neutral, suppressing the urge to call out his earlier incompetence. She had been forced to sit in that chair for what felt like hours, subjected to an unfair and demeaning experience because of the color of her skin. He could apologize all he wanted, but it wouldn't change what had just transpired. "That's right," Olivia said evenly, "and I'll expect a formal apology from the staff as well. This should never have happened." The manager nodded awkwardly, but Olivia could see the nervousness in his eyes. He was eager to move past the issue. To avoid further escalation, he turned to the security guard, his voice now a bit firmer. "David, I'll need you to escort this lady to the plane. I'll also need a full report on this incident for our records. I expect you to make sure nothing like this happens again." David, the security guard, shifted uncomfortably at the sound of his name. He shot Olivia a look of obvious frustration, but he didn't argue. Instead, he moved toward her, his body language stiff and reluctant. Olivia was about to take the first step toward the jet when a voice suddenly interrupted her. "Wait!" Olivia froze. The voice was unmistakable, a calm, confident tone that cut through the tension like a knife. She turned to see one of the other passengers, a man in a tailored suit, stepping forward. He had been one of the bystanders, watching the situation unfold, but now he was speaking up. "This is unacceptable," the man said, his voice loud enough to make others take notice. "I was watching what just happened. What this guard did," he glanced at David, his face hardening, "was completely out of line. He didn't just question her right to be here, he was disrespecting her for no reason other than her appearance." Olivia blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected anyone to speak up. She had always been on her own when it came to dealing with situations like these. But here was a man, a complete stranger, who was not only calling out the injustice but putting himself in a vulnerable position to do so. "Thank you," Olivia said quietly, her voice filled with both gratitude and disbelief. She turned to the manager. "You heard him. You can't let this stand. This guard needs to face consequences for his actions." The manager looked between the two men now, clearly uncomfortable, but the pressure was mounting. He had no choice but to acknowledge the situation, especially now that it was attracting attention. I will look into it," the manager stammered, "but please, for now, I need to ask everyone to keep calm. We don't want to make this worse than it already is." But Olivia wasn't about to let it go, not when it was clear that David hadn't just been mistaken, he had intentionally chosen to humiliate her, to dismiss her from a place she had every right to be. "Make it right," Olivia said firmly, her voice steady and unwavering. "I'm boarding this flight, but I'll be following up with the airline, and you will hear from my legal team." The bystander nodded in agreement, his expression resolute. "That's right," he added, his voice gaining momentum. "You can't just get away with something like this. It's not just a mistake, it's a pattern. You've got people in this terminal who don't belong here, who don't deserve to be here, and you treat them like this. It's not right." The manager, realizing the depth of the situation, shifted on his feet. His attempts to downplay it were failing, and he knew it. The eyes of the passengers, the other staff, even the other security guards, were now all on him. There was no way this could be swept under the rug. Finally, after a long pause, the manager nodded, though it was clear the entire situation had caught him off guard. "You're right," he said, his voice much quieter than before. "I'll make sure to address this immediately. Please, go ahead." Olivia didn't wait for another word. She gave one last glance at the guard, who was standing there, his face flushed with embarrassment, and walked toward the jet. Her steps were measured, steady. As she walked, she couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. It wasn't about the jet, or the flight, or even the apology. It was about standing her ground, about ensuring that she would never let anyone make her feel small again. As she reached the door of the plane, the stewardess greeted her with a smile. Olivia returned the smile, but it was clear that the day's events weren't over yet. The conversation she had just had, the one that had unfolded in the terminal, would stay with her long after she boarded the jet. Olivia settled into her seat on the private jet, her mind still racing with everything that had just happened. The jet, luxurious and calm, seemed like a stark contrast to the turmoil she had just experienced. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, she stared out of the window, her reflection merging with the darkening sky. The situation in the terminal had triggered so many emotions: anger, disbelief, even exhaustion, but something deeper stirred inside her, a quiet, growing sense of resolve. She couldn't let the guards' actions, or the system that enabled them, slide by unnoticed. She would take action. She would make sure that no one else would have to endure what she had just been through. The hum of the engines and the soft clink of the cabin as the seatbelt sign clicked off barely registered in Olivia's mind. She didn't even notice the stewardess who approached to offer a drink or food. Her thoughts kept returning to the moment when she had walked away from the terminal, feeling the eyes of everyone on her. The injustice had been laid bare. But she knew this wasn't just about her, it was bigger than that. It was about every person who had ever been unfairly judged or dismissed based on something as superficial as their appearance. She glanced at her phone, which had buzzed with several notifications. As expected, there were messages from her legal team, the airline, and her assistant, all inquiring about the situation and making sure she was okay. But there was one message that caught her attention, a text from an unknown number. "Olivia, I'm the man who spoke up for you in the terminal. I hope you're doing well. If you need help with anything regarding what happened, I'm here to support you. My name is David Stevens. Let's connect." Olivia stared at the message for a few moments before replying. "Thank you, David. I appreciate your support. I'll reach out once I have a chance to catch up with everything." She put her phone down, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and caution. She hadn't expected anyone to stand up for her, much less a complete stranger. But it wasn't just his words that stood out, it was the sincerity in his tone, the willingness to make a stand, to call out the injustice, even when it wasn't his fight. A few hours into the flight, Olivia finally allowed herself to relax, leaning back in her seat as the lights dimmed. The plane's interior was quiet, the faint hum of the engines offering a sense of peace. She closed her eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. Her mind kept returning to the guard, David, and the way he had treated her, as if she were invisible, as if her presence didn't matter. But it wasn't just his actions that she couldn't shake. It was the deeper issue at play, the systemic prejudice that still permeated every corner of society. Olivia had been in high positions for years. She had built her own empire from the ground up. But despite all her success, she knew that her journey hadn't been easy. She had faced discrimination at every turn, been underestimated, and often treated like she didn't belong. It was a reality that she had learned to fight against. But sometimes, it still stung. She thought about her company, the one that owned the private jet, the one that had worked tirelessly to prove its worth in an industry often dominated by others who believed they were more deserving of success. She had built this company on the belief that everyone deserved a chance, that talent and hard work should be the only measure of a person's worth. But experiences like today reminded her that the world didn't always operate that way. As the hours passed, Olivia found herself drifting in and out of sleep, her thoughts still centered on the events of the day. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her reverie. It was an email this time, from the airline. "Dear Ms. Williams, we apologize again for the unfortunate experience at the airport earlier today. We have conducted an internal review and are taking immediate action to ensure that our staff adheres to our customer service standards. We are deeply sorry for any distress caused and will be in touch regarding further steps." Olivia wasn't surprised by the apology, but she was still unsettled. It was a step in the right direction, but it wasn't enough. She needed more. She needed the airline to be held accountable, to truly understand the harm that had been done, and, more importantly, she needed to make sure that the guard, the person responsible for her humiliation, understood the consequences of his actions. But before she could respond, her phone buzzed once more. This time, it was a call. Olivia Williams. She answered, knowing exactly who it was even before the voice on the other end spoke. "Ms. Williams, this is David Stevens. I hope I'm not disturbing you." Olivia's heart skipped a beat. The man from the terminal, the one who had stood up for her. She hadn't expected him to follow through, to take the initiative to call her directly. But here he was, on the other end of the line, his voice calm but determined. "No, not at all," Olivia replied, sitting up straighter in her seat. "What can I do for you, Mr. Stevens?" Olivia knew that this was more than just about her. It was about every person who had ever been subjected to unfair treatment because of their race, their gender, or their background. She could feel the weight of the moment. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for all those who couldn't speak up, for those who had been silenced by society's prejudice. As her legal team worked tirelessly behind the scenes, she kept in close contact with David Stevens, who had proven to be not only a valuable ally but a powerful one. His connections were extensive, and his influence in various industries gave him the leverage necessary to move the case forward. Together, they began to draft a plan to confront the airline, to force them to take responsibility for the incident and to hold the guard accountable for his actions. But there was one final piece of the puzzle Olivia had to address before the story could be brought to a close: the confrontation with the security guard, David, the man who had started it all. Olivia had never expected this moment to come, but now it seemed inevitable. She had to face him, not just for the humiliation he had caused, but to show him, to show everyone, the power of accountability. This wasn't just about correcting a wrong, it was about setting a precedent. David let out a soft sigh, as though weighing his words carefully. I know this may seem sudden, but I wanted to reach out. After everything that happened today, I couldn't just stand by and do nothing. I've worked with a lot of people in positions of influence, and I know how these situations can be swept under the rug. Olivia's interest piqued. What exactly do you mean? There are things I can help with, David said, his tone shifting, becoming more serious. I know people who can get results. I've seen how these things play out before, and it's always the same. The victim is left feeling unheard, and the ones responsible face no consequences. But it doesn't have to be like that. I want to help you hold the airline accountable for what happened. Olivia took a moment to digest his words. The offer was unexpected, but it was also exactly what she needed. She had been planning to take legal action, but the prospect of working with someone who had the connections and the knowledge to move things forward faster was tempting. I appreciate your offer, Mr. Stevens, Olivia said, her voice steady. I think we could do some real good here. Let's discuss how we can move forward. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. Then David's voice returned, firmer this time. Absolutely. I'll have my team get in touch with yours. Together, we'll make sure this doesn't happen again. As Olivia ended the call, she felt a strange sense of reassurance settle over her. She had known from the start that this wouldn't be easy, that it would take more than just words to right the wrongs she had faced. But with David's support, she felt like she wasn't alone in the fight anymore. The jet flew smoothly through the night sky, and for the first time that day, Olivia allowed herself to relax. She was no longer just a woman who had been wronged. She was a force to be reckoned with, and she had the power to make change happen. The days following Olivia's encounter at the airport were a whirlwind of legal consultations, strategy meetings, and media inquiries. What had started as a deeply personal affront was quickly becoming a public issue, one that was gathering momentum. News outlets picked up the story, and soon the viral hashtags were circulating, bringing attention to the racial injustice that had unfolded at the private jet terminal. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the phone call came. Olivia was in her office, reviewing documents when her assistant passed her the phone. It was the airline's legal department, requesting an urgent meeting. The time had come. Olivia knew this wasn't going to be a simple negotiation. This was going to be a confrontation, and she would make sure it was impossible for them to look away. The meeting was scheduled for that Thursday morning at the airline's corporate headquarters. Olivia dressed with intention, wearing a sharp suit that commanded respect. She wasn't just a passenger who had been mistreated. She was a businesswoman, a leader, and she intended to make her presence felt. When Olivia arrived at the headquarters, she was escorted into a high-rise boardroom. The room was sleek, polished, and empty except for a long conference table. At the head of the table sat the airline's CEO, flanked by the legal team and a handful of senior staff members. And, sitting uncomfortably to the side, was the man who had caused all the trouble, David, the security guard. Olivia's eyes locked onto him the moment she entered the room. He was seated with his hands folded, his face flushed with embarrassment. He knew why he was there. The meeting wasn't just about the airline's mistakes, it was about him, about his actions, about the decision he had made that day. Ms. Williams, the CEO began, his tone polite but clearly defensive. We appreciate you coming in today. We've reviewed the incident thoroughly and we want to assure you that we take these matters very seriously. The guard has been temporarily suspended, and we are committed to ensuring that something like this never happens again. Olivia's gaze remained steady, her voice calm but unwavering. I'm not here for reassurances. I'm here because this goes beyond a simple apology or a suspension. This goes beyond the actions of one employee. This is about the culture of your company, the systemic issues that allow people like David to think they can treat customers like they're invisible, like they don't matter. The room went silent as Olivia's words sank in. The CEO shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but he didn't respond immediately. Olivia continued, her voice rising with the conviction that had carried her through every challenge in her life. David's behavior is a symptom of a much bigger issue. Olivia continued, this isn't just about me. It's about every person who has been dismissed or humiliated simply because they don't fit your idea of what someone should look like, or what someone should be. David shifted in his seat, his discomfort palpable. He opened his mouth to say something, but Olivia raised her hand, cutting him off. You don't get to speak yet, she said firmly. You don't get to explain away your actions. You don't get to hide behind excuses. The tension in the room was thick. Olivia turned to the CEO, her eyes hardening. You will do more than suspend him, Olivia said. I want a full public apology. I want you to make it clear that your company will no longer tolerate this kind of behavior. I want to see real change. And if you fail to take meaningful action, I'll be more than happy to take this case to court and make sure the entire world knows exactly what happened here." The CEO nodded slowly, his expression now grave. He knew that Olivia was serious, and that she had the means to carry through on her threat. Her reputation, her influence, none of it was up for debate. She had the power to bring the entire company down if they didn't act. David, still silent, couldn't hide the shame on his face. His actions had gone too far, and he knew he would be held accountable for them. But Olivia wasn't finished yet. She turned her gaze back to him. "You may have thought you were in a position of power that day," she said coldly, "but you were wrong. You don't get to decide who belongs and who doesn't, and you don't get to decide what happens to someone's dignity. But today, you've learned the hard way what it means to disrespect someone, and I hope you never forget it." For a moment, the room was still, the air heavy with the weight of Olivia's words. Finally, the CEO cleared his throat. "Ms. Williams, we will take immediate action. We understand the severity of the situation. Your demands will be met." Olivia stood up, her expression resolute. She didn't need to hear more. The matter was settled, but as she walked out of the room, a sense of quiet satisfaction settled over her. She had taken back control of the narrative. She had stood her ground, and she had forced them to confront their own complicity in a system of inequality. When she stepped outside, the bright sun met her face, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself to breathe deeply. This wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. The battle for equality and respect would continue. But today, Olivia had won.